Hi, I'm Dan Stanton, the editor and founder of Bioprocess Insider. As cell and gene therapies progress through the clinic, developers are looking to secure manufacturing capabilities. Within the CDMO space, unprecedented demand for services is driving facility expansions and a whole new M&A focus. But a growing number of end users are opting to move away from outsourcing partners and invest in their own cell and gene therapy networks. So will having in-house capabilities provide an advantage as the sector matures? This panel hopes to find out. As a journalist focused on the biomanufacturing space, the concept of capacity is fascinating. Whether it's concerns companies have unused space or mothballed facilities on hand, leading to inefficiencies and wasted costs, or whether it's a lack of production space leading to drug shortages or failures to capitalize on successful therapeutic programs, I always find it intriguing how end users manage their capacity needs, as do my readers. To make this topical, in the race to develop COVID-19 products, there is much focus on the latter concept. As while companies push antibodies and vaccines swiftly through the clinic, there are huge concerns whether there is enough capacity to push these out to a global populace. But before COVID came along and ruined both lives and face-to-face events, the question surrounding capacity was firmly fixed in the burgeoning cell and gene therapy space. And of course, it still is, and it still will be after COVID, with investments continuing to be made in both in-house and third-party capabilities to prepare for a potential onslaught of commercialized products. To join me in discussing how capacity is being managed in-house and externally, I am delighted to introduce the panel. From Leith Biopharm Group, we have Director of Cell and Gene Therapy, Joe Reininger, and from Wuxi Advanced Therapies, we have Senior Vice President and Global Head of Advanced Therapies, Felix Xu. Felix, Joe, welcome. And I think to start with, why don't we take it in turns to just briefly introduce yourselves and explain how you and your firm contribute to the cell and gene therapy landscape. Joe?
Okay, thanks, Dan, and I appreciate being part of this panel. It's a great topic to be discussing here today. So Leith Biopharm Group, we're a small life sciences consulting firm. I lead our activities in the cell and gene therapy space, as you alluded to. The services that we provide are predominantly in the area of product development, where we support clients and provide subject matter expertise in the space of CMC, as well as some regulatory and IND filings. We also work with a lot of smaller groups that are looking for non-dilutive funding, as there's more non-dilutive funding opportunities coming about for cell and gene therapies. And we've also worked doing market research programs for those in the bioprocessing area for development of new products, as well as how do they view of the customer type of programs and how they're perceived in the industry for both manufacturers as well as bioprocessing equipment and suppliers.
Thank you, Joe. So basically, your company is bang in the center of the whole cell and gene therapy ecosystem there, working with end users across all elements. Felix, do you want to do the same and tell us where Wuxi Advanced Therapies sits in the space?
Sure. So Wuxi Advanced Therapies is a contract and manufacturing organization. Our focus is on the advanced therapy space. So it's really around cell and gene therapy. And so what we have is we're a global organization with facilities both in China and also in the US. And right now we have slightly more than 200,000 square feet of manufacturing capacity in the US and about 100,000 square foot in China. And then we also have, or will have, coming on board more than 100,000 square feet of testing capacity in the US to help, with our integrated services. We have a focus right now in the cell and gene therapy space in 4 areas: AAV, lentivirus, CAR-T, and then tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes. One of the key things that we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the complexity of manufacturing by developing platforms in these key spaces that will give us more predictability and be able to help customers get to market faster. And so I think there's been good reception to that. I anticipate over time that will be things that other people are doing, is to create more standardization in this industry so that you can get products to market faster.
Thanks, Felix. And that's really interesting about platform technologies and something that hopefully we'll be able to speak about later. To begin with, though, I'd like to look at the kind of current state of capacity available to the industry. It seems to me that in the early days of cell therapy, so the Dendrians and its product Provenge, and then the first two CAR Ts that have been approved, Kymriah and Yescarta, it was kind of necessary for those to be developed and manufactured in-house, just because by the unique and relatively unknown nature of these products, there weren't very many options. But I mean, I think there are close to 400 candidates in the clinic in the US alone now. And with this, I'm wondering what the options are for a cell and gene therapy developer when it comes to looking at its manufacturing. Joe, any thoughts?
Yes, Dan. So my perspective is that, and from the people that I interact with, is that there seems to be more motion towards developing in-house platforms for newer companies, especially with the dollars that are being invested at early stage, even at Series A type of levels of investment. This allows developers to have more control over their initial timelines for getting into the clinic, which can then lead to their next series of money and advancement of their product pipeline and growth of the company. However, there's still, to me, a very large reliance, and there will be a continued reliance on the use of CDMOs for both later stage projects and products as they move forward, as a lot of companies don't want to necessarily develop the infrastructure to support a commercial operation for doing that. So, and it also, I think there's outsourcing going on to for some earlier stage products as well, so that they can advance more than one candidate at a time if their internal capabilities are getting filled up.
Felix, I think you alluded to it in your introduction there, but Wuxi Advanced Therapies was one of the earlier entrants in the cell and gene therapy CDMO space, and since you've continued to make investments to support the industry. Can you talk a bit on what Joe was saying there about the current trends, and also how you've seen industry's needs evolve, and how the CDMO space, and particularly Wuxi, has expanded to support them?
Yeah, sure. So I think with regards to companies that come in, they have a couple of options. They can do all of it in-house. They can do a blend of basically doing it themselves and then working with CDMOs on a fee-for-service type contract, or they can completely outsource it. But I think there's also a fourth option, which a number of companies are doing too, which is they will work some of the work themselves, but then they'll set up strategic agreements with the CDMOs, basically lock down space. So I think right now one of the big concerns people have is there going to be enough manufacturing capacity space for us? And by working with CDMOs to set up strategic arrangements, they lock that up. It's a little more expensive than fee-for-service, but it provides a peace of mind that the capacity will be available when they need it. And you will, I think, if you start to look at some of the things that have been released, you see that also is something that's increasing in what companies are doing. So they're not only doing it some more themselves, they're also locking into more strategic agreements, I think, with CDMOs. So I think those are all options that companies are taking a look at on how to work it. I think companies also will need to manage, in my opinion, a couple of other constraints in the industry. There is a constraint on the number of process development people available because the industry is relatively new. There's definitely a constraint on the analytical development capacity available because there's a huge demand there. We are building a new testing facility because there's constraints on QC and release testing. And then I think the other thing that people don't talk a lot about is just the constraint on raw materials, because you have so many people coming into the industry, so many companies. I think a lot of the suppliers of key raw materials have been struggling to keep up with demand. I think it'll take them a couple more years to really kind of get on top of this. I think there were a lot of struggles in the last couple of years. You'll continue to see some struggles. So those are all things that the companies have to really kind of work to manage. And what we're trying to do, and we're seeing the demand evolve a little bit. So a couple of things. There continues to be investment in this space, so we continue to see new companies created. But now we're seeing the companies that we work with in earlier phase get to later phase. And basically, not only does their demand go up for the manufacturing and testing, but the requirements go up when you go from, as you're getting ready for commercial versus clinical. I think that a number of clients are also, I think early in the days you saw a lot of orphan drug type indications. I think people are now moving to more indications that have broader patient populations. And you see people doing more systemic indications, and that's really driving up the need for capacity because you just need more product. So I think all of those things are happening, and I think right now the key emphasis is time to market. But I believe going forward, probably you're going to see more and more emphasis also being on cost. So these are all things that are important. I think the industry is hoping to do what monoclonals did. You know, in 30 years, they improved their titer tenfold. We hope to be able to do this year, but just not do it in 30 years. So there's going to have to be a lot of work on technologies and processes, conditions to try to continue to get the titers up. I think the last aspect which I mentioned earlier is that companies, CDMOs and other companies are looking to see if they can create platforms for manufacturing. A platform not only allows you to standardize the work, but once you have the platform in place, you can keep improving it. And I think you can't get to the much improvement in titers if you don't have platforms you can continually improve to get to the better titers. If you don't have standard work, you have nothing to improve. And that's, I think, a key part. So I know we're not the only ones looking at it, but that's a key part of moving the industry forward.
It's quite a comprehensive overview there of kind of the CDMO landscape and the relationship with end users. Joe, I noticed you nodding your head a little bit there, possibly about talking about the constraints within the industry. Are Felix's points resonant amongst the end users that you are dealing with?
Totally. And, you know, as it refers to platform, I think part of the strategy that companies need to envision and bring forward to the table at the beginning is that, especially in the gene therapy sector, that, you know, they should start with and try to get to as close to a finished process at the beginning as possible. As Felix alluded to, and something I'd like to get his input on was that with the validation of processes as clients and programs advance, is that, you know, how much of a strain is that providing on being able to manufacture additional products, and you know, is that, you know, taking up bandwidth, and you know, and how is that impacting things? To me, that's a personal area that I think that's really going to slow the number of approvals down. I know that Dr. Gottlieb had, you know, pronounced that they'd be approving 25 of these a year, and I've never believed that, because of all the validation work that needs to be done, et cetera. And the analytics is definitely another major component, to be able to have the analytical strategies, again, earlier as possible, and have them try to be as robust as possible and thought out as early as possible, can help facilitate getting the product development, you know, as fast as humanly possible, which is what everybody wants.
What about what Felix was saying, the locking down of capacity at third-party manufacturers? Has that really been seen before in the biologics or even the small molecule space? And is that changing the way end users are working with CDMOs and maybe the CDMO space itself?
Yes, and I think that, you know, sorry. So that definitely is a trend that people have moved to, as Felix alluded to. I've seen that as well, and that, you know, I know of CDMOs are building additional capacity specifically for that as a business model, and to be able to offer that, you know, on-demand manufacturing activity. I just don't know how much with 300 plus products, how much of that can be secured for on demand. Where's that line really get drawn from the demand capacity standpoint, as well as it takes some level of time to be able to expand and get these facilities online.
Felix, you're kind of nodding away there. From your experience at a CDMO, you talk about locking down capacity and end users having to forecast what may or may not be successful in the clinic. What sort of time scales are you seeing, and how do you balance reservation of capacity in such a large and growing market?
So, it's a good question. Usually the strategic agreements, well, initially you would do the early clinical work, and then they want to tie into a strategic agreement. But I do see customers coming in now upfront wanting to tie into strategic agreements right away. But generally what you're going to do is, if you're going to agree to a strategic agreement, you're just going to take a certain percentage of your capacity off the market. And it's going to be reserved for that particular client. And the client can do what they want with that capacity. So they can do PD work in there, they can do other work in there, they can do the manufacturing work, and sometimes they don't do any work for a period of time. They just want to know that the space is available for them. If you're doing that, then what you have to do is you have to work the rest of your capacity to accommodate the business that you have. And then the other part you look at is, we have built our facilities in a modular fashion. So we didn't fully build them out because clean room space is pretty expensive. So as that starts to happen, then you start to build out a little bit more of your facility to accommodate the demand that's going to come in. Once you get to the point where the facility is fully built out, then you have to look at the option of, okay, where do we go from here now? Do you build another space? Do you opportunistically look for space that comes onto the market? Things like that. And so those are all things that you work through the equation. But to do a strategic agreement does mean that you are taking capacity off the market for this particular client, and you'll have to balance around that.
I mean, the big, I guess the C word comes into play here, the cost. If there's basic economics, if there's this huge demand for capacity, and not only is there a shortage of supply in the first place, but much of this supply is being locked down, how is this affecting the cost of production of therapies, which are, they're never cheap to start with? Joe, any thoughts?
So, yeah, Dan, so I know that I've been working through this over the last, I'd say 7 years in interfacing with groups pertaining to viral vectors. And to me, the cost has gone up for at least initial clinical programs, at least threefold across various CDMOs that I've been in contact with over time. And to me, I think it has hit somewhat of a plateau, and I don't see that the cost is going higher, at least from my interactions right now. But I think from where it was several years ago to now, there's been a dramatic increase in the cost of producing these things and going in and doing subcontracts. I think that also goes along with for CDMOs, they've gained tons of experience, and they can help guide their clients through the quote unquote the tough times and the stuff that happens, as it always happens. There's nothing that ever goes through without a hitch. And so I think that there's, it's part of the value chain from the CDMO standpoint, is that they've now have worked with a lot of these different products, and that so there's additional value there, which justifies the cost that increases that have been, that at least I know I've witnessed over the last 7 or 8 years or so.
It's interesting that what you say about CDMOs having the expertise here, which is it's such an unknown field, or it has been such an unknown field, that perhaps some of the CDMOs who were in the space earlier on, and I'm looking at you, Felix, and Wuxi, really are able to offer the right path, the right discussions with end users on how best to produce a product. And as you also said, Felix, you plan to have capacity to scale up or scale out when necessary. But I'm curious about some of the new entrants into the space, into the cell and gene therapy space, without sort of talking about your competitors directly. There have been some big investments and movements in the CDMO space to really get into the cell and gene therapy capabilities sector. Are these companies generally trying to jump on the bandwagon, or are they actually, is this just the natural evolution of the CMO space, Felix?
I think this is a natural evolution. Anytime there is a huge demand for something, people see that as an opportunity, and what you see is capacity built. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was done in talks, 10 years ago, where there's this huge backlog on talks, and people built out a lot of talks facilities, and at some point the capacity catches up with demand. And I expect at some point in time the industry will catch up, the capacity will catch up with the industry demand. I think one of the things that will be critical, though, in the CDMO space is not just to be able to have the capacity. I think what people are going to start looking for is, do you actually have the expertise in that space? So, you know, having the right type of experience and expertise, I think there was an interesting study in Facilitate where the customer said 86% said the single most important criteria was that the CDMO had to have the right expertise for the product that they were developing. And, you know, that's part of the reason that we have chosen to narrow down our focus and just focus in a couple of areas and really build platforms, is because it is our belief that we have to have better expertise in these spaces. And by having the better expertise, we're able to basically address a lot of the problems that have happened early in the industry. So if you are able to do that, then you have a better process that's more predictable. You can do a better job of managing the inventory and carrying supply on hand. You can have a very set process to do the transfer from PD over to manufacturing. You can have prepared batch records, which can take 2 to 3 months to do. The raw materials on is much cleaner. In fact, it's done for the most part, and you don't have to do it initially for PD and then later for GMP. So there's a lot of advantages that you can do by doing that. And I think one of the things that people are really focused on today is time to market. And I think that will continue to be a focus. Probably, you know, I see that as focus for a while, but I do think over time, you know, once a number of these therapies get in the market, et cetera, then there's going to be more focus. Okay, now we have to make it cheaper. And so then you have to start looking at what type of technologies and platforms can actually get you the product cheaper. For me, AAV suspension is a classic example right now. You might have to do 200 liters to do 1 patient batch. Okay, well, that's probably long-term not sustainable. So you're going to have to figure out, how do I get a lot better titers or better output or a different production system to be able to do AAV suspension? And so these are all the type of problems I think the industry is going to look at and look to challenge and look to develop on. So, Joe, any comments on that?
Yeah, Felix. So I think that, like you alluded to, there's definitely been an influx of newer CDMOs into the space due to the demand issue. I think there are definitely some CDMOs that are better positioned than others. I know, for example, other groups that have historically worked in viral vectors and, you know, more from a vaccine side of the equation. You know, that level of experience is actually directly translatable over to this space. So I think those people have a leg up. But you know, with other newer entrants, they're going to have to go through and build that expertise to be able to, you know, otherwise the clientele that go to them are undertaking, and they should understand that they're undertaking a known risk of that they're working with a group that is not as experienced and hasn't done this as many times before, and therefore that's where they're going to possibly need their own internal team to help, you know, walk through, and having other experienced people on staff that can help guide through, and hopefully they've been through this development process before and can help do that if that's the route that they go. But yeah, I think I also echo that, you know, I've done market research with, you know, for CDMO selection, and you know, experience and expertise for the product was definitely in line with what Felix had said. That's the number one thing that people are looking for, and actually the cost is actually much lower on that list.
So people really go for the expertise, because
Totally.
and I mean, is that because it's such an unknown space? You know, 10, 20 years down the line, when systems and regulations and the actual effective therapies are kind of known, will it kind of mirror more the biologic space or the small molecule space? But I'm wondering if that's going to happen in the future. But right now, we are just in this midst of knowledge is power, and that is what people are after. And platforms.
Well, I definitely think that's the case, Dan. That knowledge is power, and being able to leverage that and be able to help people avoid potholes. I mean, that's, you know, and getting to the clinic and meeting your development milestones is number one critical. I'm sorry, Felix, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think Joe had mentioned earlier that no matter what project you do in this space, something will go wrong. I have yet to see a project that was perfect, and I don't think I'm going to see one. And so really what you're trying to do with the platforms and the knowledge is minimize the number of potholes and issues you're going to have. And then when you do run into those, be able to fix them much more quickly because you have an understanding of what's wrong and how you can fix it. And so those are all things that you're really taking a look at, because if you don't really have expertise in an area and something goes wrong, you could spend months just trying to figure out what's going on. If you understand the process and as well characterize something goes wrong, you generally have a pretty good idea and can fix that, you know, in weeks instead of months. And that makes a huge difference to the customer. So
I want to pick up on platform technologies again, Felix. It's both you and Joe have mentioned this a few times. I know recently at Wuxi, you've launched your own closed process system for CAR-T. I mean, it's a very different world to the biologics or the small molecule space where you're actually developing these processes, these technologies. So I'm wondering how you balance the development of your kind of own technologies with working with tech vendors, either the traditional vendors or new vendors coming through on the equipment side.
So what we try to do on the platforms is we picked a couple of areas we know that there's high demand, so that if you take the time and effort to do a platform, there's a sufficient customer base for. So it takes us anywhere from 12 to 18 months to develop a platform. So it's not something that we do in 2 or 3 months. And there's a lot of experiments, a lot of characterization, a lot of design of experience that you have to do to get a much more predictable process. And you're also looking at a lot of different technologies, whether it's cell lines or plasmids or things like that. In the process of doing that, we do also, for something like a closed CAR-T, take a look at what's the best equipment to standardize to. And then from there, you work with a number of different vendors, because the other part you want is you want to have fairly standard equipment. And it's good for a couple of reasons. You want your people to be trained on the same equipment so they know how to use it. So they're not trying to figure out, well, this is different from this and I have to do this and get that in. You want the equipment that's generally considered the best in the industry or amongst the best in the industry, so you know the results that you get from that particular piece of equipment will be consistent and reliable. And then you'll put the whole thing together. The trickiest part in this industry, which I do think for companies with new technologies and new products, is that to a certain extent, the industry is actually conservative. A lot of people that want to kind of come out and develop the cell and gene therapies as quickly as possible want to do it with proven technology. They don't necessarily want to try something new, because if it doesn't work, then they're going to get blamed for picking the wrong technology. And so I do see a certain amount of conservatism there. To me, it's the old, what IBM used to say, nobody ever got fired for buying an IBM, right? Very predictable. So I do think there's some of that in there. At least we see more of that on the manufacturing plants. People they kind of know what the gold standards are, and they kind of want to go with the gold standards to a certain extent. I do think that, new technologies will continue to come in, but I don't think they're as quickly adopted as some people may think. I think the other wild card in that is some of these new companies don't have a great deal of funding. So do you want to take a new company, a new technology, and not be sure the company's going to be around in 2 years when you get to later phase manufacturing? So I think there's a number of factors in there. We have tried and we are continuing looking at new technologies. We're looking at also new raw materials to improve things and things like that. But we also have to make sure our customers agree to do that too. So.
It might be an unanswerable question for you, Joe, but I'm wondering how many platforms are going to come and go within the space before we get to a far more standardized approach in cell and gene therapies, particularly taking into account Felix's point about us being in a very conservative industry.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that there's going to be, I don't know how much is going to be brand new and it's going to look like, it's not going to be the Tesla on the market versus the Mercedes or Chevy, or pick your brand of car that you like. But I think that there's going to be, systemic, or not systemic, but, integral steps of evolution of existing platforms. I don't know how much is going to be revolutionarily new. I think that there's going to be a lot of learnings as to, for example, with sampling of certain bioprocess equipment that can be improved there, and that sort of thing. And then another element to that is, I think Felix kind of alluded to it, but is that you want to have a good supply chain to be able to support these new things. So you don't want to necessarily have to go with somebody that's got a sole source for being able to get the components, as that can also be a real nightmare for that. But I think there's going to be some improvements. I think personally for me, I think there's going to be cell line evolution to enhance titers to drive, and that's going to be a major driver for this, analogous to the MABs. Right now, I think people are just so hairy-carry to get to the clinic and advance the programs that they're not worried about it yet. But making 200-liter batch to dose one patient is not cost-effective.
So, in a similar vein, is it going to be a flurry of M&A in the or licensing either of processes and platforms, or mergers within the CDMO space? Felix, your thoughts?
Yeah, you're already seeing quite a bit of it. You're seeing people license technologies. As an example, you see licensing of things like plasmids by different companies or cell lines. You see a lot of M&A activity taking place with CDMOs where they're buying different CDMOs. I have a list of those that you can take. And then you also see different companies actually getting into the space. Somebody like a Thermo Fisher, who's doing a lot of the supplies and raw materials, now all of a sudden getting, buying into the manufacturing of the cell and gene therapies. So I think this is an industry that is continuously evolving. You're going to see, I think, ongoing mergers and acquisitions. I think you're going to see ongoing licensing of technology. And I think there's going to be a lot of tuck-ins too, where people are finding a particular technology and then they buy it to work it into their platform and things like that. So I think if you look at it and just, look at the news in the last 12 months, there's a lot of this that's been taking place, and I think it'll continue. So I think that'll continue for a while, because I think the other part is a lot of CDMOs are looking not just to add capacity, but to be able to expand from a geography standpoint. Be able to say, not only do we have the coverage here in US, but we have the coverage in Europe, for instance. And to me is as much a play, especially if you're in the autologous field. I don't think you really need to do that so much if you're doing gene therapy or allogeneic cell therapies. But if you're doing autologous, fresh products, that type of thing, you really do need the geographic presence in the market that you're serving. So I anticipate that this will continue to go for the next couple of years.
That's interesting what you say about autologous products, and there have been a flurry of deals, European and Chinese and Asian capacity and capabilities being bought up by companies. I think we're going to move on to talk about the in-house side of things here, because I think the CDMO space is continually evolving as we've spoken about, but there have been over the past year or two a growing number of end users kind of opting to assumingly move away from outsourcing partners in the whole and invest in their own cell and gene therapy networks. I mean, Pfizer is building a $500 million facility in North Carolina. Novartis has heavily invested in its own network and even acquired its CAR T CDMO in France, Cell4Cure. And Astellas, they acquired Audentes late last year for I think it was about $3 billion, citing that the addition of a viral vector facility as a huge motivation. Joe, I guess the big question here is how much of a competitive advantage does having your own capabilities have for a cell and gene therapy developer?
Well, I'm kind of biased on this answer, as before I joined Latham, I was working at a smaller biotech, and we had our own internal manufacturing. This was for biologics, and it essentially it enabled us to be able to do our product development as fast and as economically as possible, since we had the control over it. So to me, again, I think it goes to the overall strategy of the company from when it's formed, and that these decisions and this type of thought process needs to be evaluated early on to determine what the best path is, and to be able to, if you're going to have a product of one or two that you're looking for before you exit, if you're a newer entrant, or if you're looking to try to take it all the way and become more of a fully integrated company, I think then the questions are different, or the answers to that question are very different. And so again, I tend to be on the side of wanting to have a pilot facility that can handle the early stage level of manufacturing, as I think it's it provides the control element is critically important.
And Felix, from the CDMO point of view, are these investments by some of the big players and these comments by them as well somewhat disconcerting, or is it just the kind of natural way of the biopharma industry as a whole to kind of balance the in-house and the outsource?
I think it's natural. I think that's going to happen, and I think we'll see what happens. I think right now there's some people who are going to be very successful at bringing in-house, and then there's going to be other people that are going to sell their facilities. A mix of two. I can say on a number of instances, at least 2 or 3, we've been approached about taking over a facility from somebody who built in-house. So I anticipate it'll be mixed success like anything else. Some people will do very, very well with it, and some people will just find out that they probably should have waited before they built a building. So, I think you can argue on it both sides. I think from my standpoint, it really depends on what's driving. You do get more control with your own facility. I do think, though, that if you're going to build your own facility, it's an incredible amount of time and senior management resource. And if you do that, you're going to limit the amount of products you can take into clinical. So it's part of a control versus the number of shots on goal. My standpoint is one of the things that you look at strategically. I think the other aspect from my standpoint is, when you first build your building, if you have, some people have done without even getting into GMP, so you truly don't know what your process looks like. So if you're going to do that, are you actually building a facility that's optimized for your process? And do you actually know how much capacity that you need? Because if you don't, then you're going to end up having something that's going to drag on your P&L for years. So, there's a couple different ways to do it. One of the ways that companies can do it, though, is they can do part of it themselves. you can do part of the early commercial with the CDMO to get a much better feel for what the real demand will be in the market. And then a couple of years later, roll out with your own facility that now is, you know what the design is, you know what the manufacturing process is. Now you have a much higher certainty of what the demand will be, so that you can more right size the facility. So there's different ways to do it. I think, you can look at a number of different ways, but we've seen both. I've seen companies that are doing well, and I've also seen companies that are really struggling and are trying to offload their facility. So I don't think there's a right answer. I think it's dependent. I also think it's dependent on what's more important to you, getting as many products into clinical as possible, or that control aspect of your manufacturing, because that'll also weigh in what type of decision you make.
It sounds like an exceptionally risky process, going gung-ho into creating your own facilities and your own capabilities, and especially in such a unknown, a relatively unknown field. I'm wondering, though, if some of the constraints within the cell and gene therapy space that we spoke about earlier, the kind of lack of resources, a lack of capacity, a shortage of capacity, is driving companies to take the risk, perhaps in a way that we never really saw in the monoclonal antibody space. Joe, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that is, I think people are starting to eye that after, I think that tends to come if they've got unrealistic expectations of okay, I've got this candidate and it looks like it's going to be a game changer for this orphan disease indication, and you go and then interface with the CDMOs, and then you get the timelines back of what's really involved with going through the manufacturing process development and the analytics to actually make the product and to be able to bring it forth. And then I think I think from going through that, if they don't have realistic expectations of how long it's going to take, then they might pivot and say, all right, well, we could do this ourselves. And I think that might be a little bit of a hasty decision. But I think that would be the part of the driving force, is that, if they've made potentially unrealistic suggestions as to when their clinical development timeline is going to be, without having entered into the conversations on and having really thought through what they're going to need from the amount of product, as well as the timelines to get it there. I think then that would be one of the driving forces that would potentially drive people to make their own and enhance and build their own facilities.
And Joe said something I think is also, he said the size of the Series A's and the size of the Series B's today.
Yep.
In the past, you might not have had the luxury.
Nope.
Because
$50 to $100 million is ridiculous.
Right. So I think the other factor that people have to consider is, right now, because the rounds have been so big, companies do have the option now to look at, do we build our own building? I think if you looked 5 years ago when the rounds were much smaller, it was much less of a question, because you didn't have the option.
Yep.
The building, you wouldn't have any money left to do your clinical. So yep. I think that's part of the driver exactly too. Right. It's just the money that's raised, and as long as that type of money is there, that option is going to exist. If the money starts to come down in terms of sizes of these Series A's and Series B's, I think we also revisit the question a little bit from that perspective.
But is the prospect of having an in-house capabilities, therefore driving these huge funding rounds? Is it a chicken and egg situation? Is the money being raised increasing because investors want to be assured that they will have the capacity, or how's the balance go, Joe?
So I view that in two ways. I think one reason might be that again, that the idea of developing and having that having the financial resources to expand and develop the manufacturing is one element. I think the other is that for the venture equity and so forth that comes in, is that perhaps they want to make sure that there's a sufficient runway and that they can go through the partnering and strategic partnerships that we discussed earlier with CDMOs, so that they make sure that they have that manufacturing capacity and locked up, and that that's not going to be an issue, and that then the additional larger amounts can be to advance multiple programs at a time. So I think it's partially broken up in both ways, and I would think it's probably more of a 50-50 type of scenario as to whether or not they're going to look to build internal capacity versus saying, okay, we've got the runway to go out X number of years based on this, and we can bring X number of products in with a strategic CDMO partnership.
I want to take the conversation back to what I mentioned in the introduction with COVID-19. Obviously, we are all speaking to each other on for a video conferencing software rather than being on the exhibition hall in San Diego. I do wonder if the sudden rush to secure COVID-19 vaccine and therapeutic capacity, especially on this sort of the viral vector-based vaccines, if that's stressing the already stretched cell and gene therapy capacity at all, or if it's just, these are just headline-grabbing announcements that don't really change the constrained nature of the cell and gene therapy space. Not sure who wants to talk about that.
Well, I'll go first. So, Felix, you go ahead. I jumped in on the other one.
Yeah, I would simply say it's creating some interest, because if you are working with a COVID company that wants to get in there, they do want the capacity now. And when they want it, they want a lot of it, because they're anticipating they're going to produce a lot of product, and they're not going to have a big window to do it. Or they're not sure, I guess a better way, they're not sure how big that window will be with COVID, right? There's a lot of uncertainty around that. And so that's one thing. And so those type of deals to me are definitely strategic partnerships. On the flip side of it, what you are seeing is that a lot of your normal customers that you kind of work into your pipeline have to do work a lot differently. So, where it used to be you could visit them in person, they'd fly down to see you, they would, want to visit your facility, they'd want to meet face-to-face with your technical team and all those other things. They can't do that. And find different ways to work with them. And what they have to do is start looking if they want to maintain their timelines and making decisions without doing their normal, I would say, due process of kicking the tires and doing some of the other things. So I think that makes it interesting for a number of our customers to figure out how we've been working with them to be able to meet remotely, to be able to, have them see the facility and things like that, to try to help them with the decision-making and their timelines. And I think the other part that has been helpful, and I will say this, is if you do have a platform where they can, basically take, for instance, their gene of interest and get started right away in PD, and a lot of that's already been laid out, that's much more friendly in a COVID type environment than if something has to be done from scratch and it's a custom project. So that's the other aspect of it that when we talk to the customers, they begin to realize there is an advantage when you kind of put something like that together, as opposed to them, because if you're doing it from scratch, a lot of times they're coming in, you're meeting, you're having your kickoff meeting, there's a lot of back and forth, they want to be in the person, they want to see the lab, they want to work with you in the lab. A lot of that stuff is on, and that requires a lot of travel, a lot of interaction, a lot of stuff. Very hard to do in COVID environment. Mm-hmm. If you have a way that they can get a comfort level that the process is good, that it works, and you have checkpoints that can give them feedback, good timely feedback that it's working, that can work well in today's environment. And so I don't think platforms were developed with COVID in mind, but I do think that in a COVID environment, they're probably a lot more user-friendly and useful than trying to do it the standard custom way. So.
And Joe?
I was going to answer the question a little bit differently. I was going to say that, there are, from the CDMO capacity standpoint, that with the amount of money that the federal government has been putting into this, and there are over 100 different vaccines now in development for COVID-19 that I don't know the number that are actually viral vector based, but there's many of them that there has been a limitation put out by various, or at least a subset of CDMOs, that they are now essentially, that's the primary work that they're doing currently, or moving forward at least in the near term over the next couple of months, that they're going to be predominantly focused on COVID response type of things. I would say that that's a smaller subset of CDMOs from the vector manufacturing standpoint, and those that typically have a history in particular for doing work with the federal government. There's a handful of them. Government contract work is not cut out for everybody. And I think, though I don't know how much it's going to impact, and maybe Felix can chime in on this, is that I view that the COVID responses with the numbers of doses that the various that are being bandied about in the news, we're going to make 300 million doses, and I'm like, where are you going to get 300 million vials from within the next year? And if you've got 5 groups that are talking about doing that, then that's, I don't view that there's enough supply chain for the actual container closure system to be able to handle that. So I don't know if that's coming up on Felix's radar or not, but I know that I'm working with other groups that are developing COVID vaccines, and that's one of the major concerns that we're worried about right now, is being able to, is there going to be something to put it in? We can make the vaccine, can we get it to the actual delivery mechanism to the...
Felix, are you seeing it come up on your radar?
Well, I think it's a fair concern, and what we're trying to do obviously is you're getting your bill of materials, you're checking with all the vendors, you're trying to see lead times and supply, and trying to work that aspect of it. And then I think what you're going to try to do is just try to work out arrangements. The other part you have to do is you can't be single sourced on this. So where possible, and sometimes in this industry it's hard, where possible, get second or third sources, because there's going to be tight constraints in this. And I think Joe's right there. You're going to have to manage the supply chain very closely. We are already seeing in a couple of areas for some raw materials that the lead times are really stretched out, and because they're being used for COVID purposes. So my anticipation is that you're just going to have to manage that aspect of it the best you can, but it's going to be there. I think it's definitely going to be there.
My final question, I think going back 3 months, the news from my standpoint and company announcements were massively cell and gene therapy orientated, skewed. Every new and exciting process or deal was very much in the cell and gene therapy space. That's obviously changed with COVID. So I'm wondering, within the industry itself, whether COVID has slowed down momentum in the cell and gene sector, and whether we can, whether or when momentum will pick up again, if it has.
Well, I'll chime in first, I guess. So I think things have slowed down, and I think that's just been due to the pandemic response of, although for the CAR T type of things, I don't know, but if it's considered a more of an elective type of procedure or not, but been doing some recent work in understanding this as well, and it looks like the amount of, at least from the commercial product side, that they've kind of plateaued recently, and that this might be one reason for it, and that the oncologists and the more routine, if you want to call this routine, type of activities aren't taking place because of concerns over potential spread of infection, and especially with these people afflicted with these types of conditions, they're definitely on the compromised end of the spectrum, and then they have something also quite serious to potentially contend with.
And Felix, maybe final thoughts here?
Yeah, I think it is having impact. I mean, we know for sure, as you take a look, for instance, it's impacting clinical trials, which I think is what Joe's referencing. So
Yep.
clinical trials are being delayed. People are, they're going to be slower to get the approvals. And, quite frankly, a lot of hospitals aren't even passing new clinical trials right now because they're busy dealing with COVID. So I think that's part of it. I think there's also an impact for people who are using academic centers to help, do the early manufacturing of some of the product. I think that's also, being interrupted, or there's hiccups there as these academic centers throw the resources towards COVID. And so maybe they're not doing some of the focus that they were doing on the cell and gene therapy side, things like so. Indirectly, if you start to look, there's a lot of different areas that there's being impact on this. I think, as the situation with COVID, we don't know when it'll happen, but as the situation eases and things get back to normal, I think things will pick up again. But there'll be a little bit of a lag as people kind of get back into the routine and start to get through these things. I think there's still, plenty of pent-up demand. I think people are still trying to work very aggressively in the market and things like that. But just how you do the work, as I mentioned earlier, is interrupted. And then just, the timelines and everything that they laid out are being interrupted by how quickly they're able to recruit patients, or even in some instances, I'm aware where the clinical trials didn't even kick off because of COVID. So I just think all of that's going to be affected, and it will probably slow down for a number of people, how quickly they're able to get their product out and approved. So
There's going to be clamoring to get going, though.
yeah, they will.
Once some of the restrictions are lifted, it's going to be quite interesting.
Well, I very much look forward to continuing these discussions and see what actually happens when those restrictions are lifted and we get back to some sort of new normal, as everyone is banding around. On that note, I would just like to say thank you so much for joining me, Joe Reininger from the Leith and Biopharm Group and Felix Xu from Wuxi Advanced Therapies. And here's to next year, bio in person. Thank you.
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Great to see you again, Dan. Thanks.
Pleasure.